Good morning and afternoon, evening to all of you, wherever you are, from Boston, Massachusetts, and the Institute for Sustainable Energy. We're delighted and honored to have you sharing a part of your Zoom day with us. And we're going to talk about an incredibly important topic with an incredibly distinguished and wise panel of folks. It's a particular treat for me because I have known many of these folks for a long time, respected their work, and we've never managed to get them together here at the Institute, and virtually now we can. We're going to have 3 presentations by our speakers, and then have what we hope is ample time for questions from the audience out there and discussion amongst them. So we don't intend for this to be an entire hour and a half of presentation and one-way talking. So let me just very briefly introduce the panelists now, and then we'll turn it over to them to move through their remarks and then to the discussion section. Our first speaker will be Amy Myers-Jaffe, Professor Amy Myers-Jaffe. She is Managing Director of the Climate Policy Lab at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts University, and a former state official in California, former faculty member at Columbia, and also a former senior scholar, I probably have the title wrong, at the Council on Foreign Relations. Next, we'll hear from Professor Dan Kammen, a professor of energy at UC Berkeley. I believe he runs the energy research group there, I think the oldest and most venerable energy research academic program in the United States. And he's also a former science envoy to President Obama. And last but not least, our hometown hero, Professor Robert Kaufman, professor in the Department of Earth and Environment here at Boston University, longtime colleague of mine, and energy expert on oil markets and energy demand, widely published author, and avid bicyclist. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Amy, and would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, thanks so much. I am so pleased to be here. So great to be on this panel, to be with former colleagues, Dan and Robert, and former collaborators. So be fun to discuss the future of energy with both of you, especially in light of COVID. Now, I felt like, I know this is going to date me generationally to do a David Letterman bit for the beginning of my slideshow, 5 top reasons. But I feel like we have a lot of students out there, and a lot of people are following all the energy memes on Twitter today because of the debates last night. So I wanted to be super timely. So I decided I would do each meme, and then I'll have a few remarks about digital, because I have a book coming out calling Energy's Digital Future, and it's relevant to our discussion today. So for the media that's watching, if there are people from the media, let's talk first tiny windows. If you were a student at Tufts or BU or Berkeley, or hopefully other schools are tuning in, you should be taking a class on energy efficiency, because that is going to be a large way we're going to get to net zero energy. And when we think about building efficiency, we don't think about tiny windows. We actually think about double glazing, low emissivity, smart heat reflective glass, and smart building, weatherization, so forth. So just want to be correcting the tiny window reference. We don't need to go to tiny windows. Here in California, we have these beautiful LEED buildings that have giant eerie windows that are unbelievably energy efficient, and beautiful architectural spaces. Okay, energy independence. big favorite of the president, big favorite, frankly, of President Obama too. Let's just not get too obsessed with the fracking leading to energy independence. I mean, it did certainly help, but actually take Europe, for example, talking about how the Russians can't use the energy weapon anymore. That is as much about renewable energy and electrification as it is US imports of LNG. In fact, I would argue that certainly now and then over time, renewable energy and electrification is making a huge difference in Europe. It's forced the Russians to reconsider their marketing strategy in Europe for everything. And it will be a giant contributor to net zero. The Europeans know that. That's why they're having a $1 trillion initiative to move in that direction. Destroying the industry, destroying the oil industry. Let's talk about what's happened today to the oil industry. For those who want to call in and ask me questions about the oil industry, I can tell you about how COVID has seemed to accelerate the concept of peak oil demand. In other words, that oil demand is down. Demand for oil in the transportation sector is down 30% year on year, despite the fact that it's up a little bit in India because more people are using cars to commute to work, and despite some mixed signals about how
Is that
people
worldwide, Amy?
Worldwide, in the first 6 months of the year. And of course, in air transportation, it's down even more significantly. All of that trend and concern and the commitments to net zero are causing investors to pivot. So are they diversifying their portfolio? How are they recalculating their idea of what the next 20-year multiple for revenues is going to be for a company like Exxon versus what they might have thought 5 years ago? That's causing repricing in the stock market. You're seeing a lot of investors interested in investing in clean companies and technology companies that they see are going to be growth companies going forward. Energy transition is a major factor for investors. That's going to be critical towards net zero. Tremendous fumes. I'm going to give the president the benefit of the doubt. I think what the president meant was that when you produce steel for wind blades and other parts of a wind generation, it enhances emissions. That is what I think he was trying to say. But that said, because I'm coming to you from Massachusetts, which has a giant deep water wind initiative along with other neighboring states, let me just say that Bloomberg New Energy Finance and others are projecting the cost of electrolyzers, that is the equipment it takes to convert wind energy to green hydrogen, so emissionless hydrogen, is going to come down and be competitive or more less expensive than making hydrogen from other sources, and also probably be competitive with other kinds of energy carriers. And that's going to be an enabling technology, especially for the decarbonization of heavy industry, including steel. So I'm going to say I'm not going to give the president a checkbox for the tremendous fumes, because I'm optimistic about long-term what we're going to be able to do with wind and green hydrogen. Geniuses in Silicon Valley. There are a lot of geniuses in Silicon Valley, it's true. And they are coming up with digital technologies that could be really enabling for decarbonization. But I will talk to you today about the pros and cons of that, because if everyone listening today were to go back in their Ubers as a single rider and take every single trip in Uber and avoid the subway, which is what's was happening pre-COVID, the emissions consequences of all those extra rides in ride sharing is actually quite carbon intensive. So, but let me just say, because UC Davis has studied this, if you're not buying an essential good and you're deciding that you're not going to drive to the mall, you're just going to do it on a vendor like Amazon, you're going to buy stuff on Amazon and let them use their AI digital optimization program. So you're not asking for speedy 1 hour delivery. You're going to be socially responsible and let the AI deliver your package in the most efficient time window so that they're delivering packages to all your neighbors at the same time, highly carbon saving, 20% less emissions than if you were to, like you and I and my neighbors, we all go and buy those things individually in cars. So that's my 5 minutes. Now, for those who are tuned in.
But speaking of 5 minutes, that's what you have.
Okay, in my last 5 minutes, I met my 5 points, but yes, good thing I mentioned 5 minutes because I was wondering how far along I am. So in the oil market now, we are seeing, a very different expectation stream because we have this massive buildup in oil inventory during the COVID the first wave, which really the lockdowns almost, eliminated a giant amount of oil demand overnight and therefore created this giant 1 billion barrel surplus of oil. Most of that has not been worked off, and that's influencing how people are seeing the price for 2021 and maybe even 2022. And then it's also causing a debate about the decoupling of oil prices from economic growth and whether that could be a sustained phenomenon, whether that's because of telecommuting or different attitudes about international travel or some other technologies, which I'll talk about in a minute. That is becoming a key influencer of future oil and gas prices. And I'm not saying that oil and gas prices couldn't go back up if no one's investing in oil and gas, of course. We might have less supply, obviously. But anyway, that's what's going on right now in the market. When we think about the energy transition, here is some very good study from IRENA about how the commodities we use today for total final energy consumption might change. I would agree with this study that electrification is going to be a big piece of the transition to net zero. And so therefore, giving you sort of an overview of how we might move, some with energy efficiency, some with modern biomass, though I'm not quite as optimistic as they are about the 16%, but I'll defer to Dan Kammen on that. But definitely electrification is going to be a big share of what we're going to do, though I might be a slightly bigger believer in hydrogen than this slide would indicate. Now, let me just show you some statistics and tell you quickly. Investors are definitely denying capital to oil and gas. We've had some of the big banks say they won't even fund any exploration in the Arctic anymore. Obviously, there's a huge shift out of coal finance. And, the market valuation of the big coal companies is, rapidly moving to zero. But one of the reasons why investors are liking a company like a Tesla or NextEra is they believe that those companies are investing in forward-looking technologies. In Tesla's case, some of the technologies are not even car related. Either it could be a stationary battery application from their energy business. They have a micro film system in the cars that hyperfilter that keeps bioterrorist agents and pandemic agents from getting in your car. I mean, they have so many technologies that they could cash in on, that investors are looking at that. And they don't believe that Exxon has any kind of forward view on technologies they're going to hit, and they certainly don't have any they're deploying. And that, I think, explains a lot about why valuations are moving in different directions. Final point, we're having a technology revolution. It's going to revolutionize and tremendously transform how we use, produce, and sell energy. So my final point would be in that, I thought I had one more slide, which is that there's some technologies where their impact are not considered an energy impact, but there will be. Something like 3D printing, for example, which now seems to be more accelerated and interesting. If you are 3D printing your manufactured goods, say a jet engine, and you're going from 300 or 500 parts to the engine to 8 parts, as they have, Cessna's already done with their Denali smaller plane. It means that you're not making all those parts all around the world. You're not putting them on a truck to bring them to the port. You're not putting on a ship to ship them to an assembly plant. You're not putting them on a truck to get to an assembly plant. All that intensely eliminates oil in the transport sector. So there are these applications that are not considered energy applications that are coming, that are going to greatly reduce the amount of oil we use, whether that's recycling plastic into plastic, whether that's transportation technologies, AI for efficiency, telecommuting, et cetera. So thank you, and looking forward to hearing my other presenters.
Thank you, Amy. Just one comment. Silicon Valley has no monopoly on geniuses. They're everywhere. And I commend to you all the Hidden Genius Project. When you have a chance, Google that. Thank you. Very, very interesting stuff. Lots to think about. And with that, I'd love to hear from Dan and his thoughts on the future.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's great to follow Amy. It's been great to work with her. And I think we share a lot of views in terms of hydrogen and other really exciting areas. And so I'll also show some slides to kind of give a feeling for how things are going from my perspective. And so what I'll start off with is an overly complicated kind of a greeting, and that is that the work that we do out here in my laboratory is really enabled by this just fascinating group of students that we tend to get, people who are highly interdisciplinary, people thinking about the connections, a lot of things that Amy highlighted, how changes in one area, whether it's Internet of Things, affects what's going on in other areas. And so I always like to start off by kind of thanking the students that have passed through our lab to kind of look at how we can think about energy in terms of markets and poverty and innovation and all the changes that we need. And so just to start off with the theme for the talk today, what's been the impact of COVID? And we all have seen the horrific downside, but a big partnership that our lab is engaged with faculty across China and Germany, other UC campuses, recently published, actually Monday of this week, a paper charting how much COVID had impacted CO2 emissions worldwide. And the detailed graphs show global pictures down 10%, China initially down 20%. But really the summary is that coal use since January is down 10%. And each percentage on a global basis is just massive. And oil gas use is down by 4%. And during the same period of time, renewable energy is up 3%. And that really kind of sets the standard for how much the markets can change. Now, no one is saying that COVID is a good decarbonization strategy. It would come in at sort of infinite dollars per ton of carbon, but it does highlight how fast the system can change if we can think differently about what we want going forward. And so in California, we had a plan to be at 20% renewable energy by 2010. We missed that target. We didn't get to 20% until 2013. We threw a party celebrating our lateness, but our 2020 target was 33%, and we're about 39 or 40% today. And in California, we don't count large hydro, and we don't count nuclear, which kind of gives you a feeling for things. Our target for 2030 was 50%, but after we passed Senate Bill 100 calling for 100% clean energy by 2045, we've now upped that target to 60. And if you include nuclear and large hydro, both contentious here in California, we've been running at well over 60% for the last several months. And so it really kind of speaks to how much that transition really can happen. Now, the two events that happened a couple weeks ago that I kind of want to highlight in thinking about a post-COVID energy market world is that just a month ago, California announced that we were going to end the sale of new internal combustion vehicles by 2035. And the interesting feature is that some people loved it and said this is transformative for such standard in the United States. Others said, well, this is way too slow. The market may get us to that well before that in terms of the price differences. And so it highlights you can be on the leading or bleeding edge, but also be kind of criticized as you go. The other big announcement that happened the next day, of course, is that China, which had already said that they were going to peak emissions by 2030, announced they were going to get to carbon neutrality by 2060, which from most of the analysis that my team and a team at Tsinghua University has just done indicates electricity really needs to peak by 2050. And those numbers are interesting because that mid-century date is when the IPCC, of which I'm a part, has said we need to get to basically totally decarbonized, 90 or 95% down if we're going to meet the 1.5 degree revised Paris target. And I say that because this kind of really links together its topics I think we'll talk about today. On the one hand, we have these fascinating decarbonization trends. On the other hand, we have 1 billion people on the planet that don't have access to even basic services. And while we think of them mainly in developing countries, this is a challenge in inner city areas too. But in California, we now have more people employed in the solar industry than in the fossil fuel industry by a big margin. And more people are in solar than are employed at our utilities. And that really speaks to the degree to which one can see this transition, just as Vice President Biden has said, as a big job creator. But it highlights the justice components of the story as well. Now, I won't do the details on a graph that probably most people on this call know about, and that is solar has fallen just remarkably and steadily in price, so that solar and wind are now the cheapest new installation energy technologies, not only this year, but last year and 2018. And there's lots of cool math one could do about these so-called learning curves. But when you hear that solar has fallen like a rock in price, it's also the case that there's lots of neat innovations to go, from floating solar to transparent solar to wearable. There is a whole world of innovations not yet exploited. And so there's lots of places to build new markets for clean energy. And while a lot of people know the story for solar, an equally nerdy plot shows the drop in prices we've seen for energy storage. And this just shows that that same so-called log linear or power law decrease we see for solar is taking place for lots of different storage technologies, from lithium ion to flow battery, lots of features. So when we think about markets that can be truly zero carbon in the long term, we've got lots of technology options. Now, the role of natural gas, the fracking, et cetera, it really highlights a world that if you look at what's the cheapest new technology to install in the United States, this is not using kind of Berkeley West Coast data. This is from University of Texas, Austin. What you can see on here is that while gas is still the least cost technology southeast and northwest, largely wind in the middle of the country and solar in the southwest is the cheapest overnight technology, not subsidized. Of course, we in California don't live in this world, neither do you in Massachusetts, where there is a price of carbon. It's lower than ours. But if I were to use the California price, $20 a ton, you can see we're in a map that is essentially dominated by wind and solar, tiny pocket of nuclear, although they do the nuclear math in an interesting way. And gas has really been marginalized. And if we jump to $50 a ton, the so-called social cost of carbon, that's not on the map anywhere in the US at this point, you can see we're in a world where we are essentially dominated by the renewables. And it's a fascinating picture to think about. What would it take to get everyone in the US to a California price, and let alone to this social cost of carbon? Now, the things that are getting much less attention, that are dramatically changing these markets, we had last year an event that I call the shift in the gold standard. So just last year, California, our Public Utilities Commission, shifted the referent price, meaning the backstop energy technology, from natural gas to energy storage. And that means that when there needs to be an assessment for what's the least cost in a given new project or market, we don't look at gas anymore. We look at energy storage. At the same time, at the federal level, which we don't talk a lot about what's been happening under Mr. Trump, but something fascinating has happened, and that is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has now authorized states to move ahead on carbon pricing. Now, I don't think carbon pricing is going to solve any or even most of our climate problems, but it sure resets the landscape when the federal agencies have finally caught up and are thinking about how markets can evolve when these environmental costs become part of the story. So kind of just to highlight a few of the things that have happened that really build new markets and highlight that we could be in a much more job-creating, clean energy world than a dirty one. In California, we already have passed, it took us a lot of years to get this through, but as of January of this year, now every new home in California must generate as much energy as it consumes. Solar on the roof, super energy efficient, as Amy highlighted. And it's not just this that we can do today. After all, we have 1 million solar rooftops in California today, including mine. But we see it going on not only in single family homes, like this yellow one down here, but multifamily homes too. And this is really the start of a push into environmental justice, which I think is going to be the biggest piece of our changing energy landscape over the next couple of years. We didn't just say that homes have to be net zero. We've also passed an audacious measure, and that is by 2030, our office buildings. Now, we don't know how to do this economically. We can think about it in terms of solar skins, storage in the basement, but this is a market untapped, and thinking about revitalizing our buildings is really the frontier of thinking about how these low carbon economies can work. And Amy mentioned hydrogen, which I can't imagine won't play a central role. Energy storage. This is a facility in Southern California. You can see powered by solar. These are 2 liquid flow batteries. And this is a storage facility which is arbitraging on the market. They either generate their own or they buy power when it's like low cost at night, and they sell it back into the market, a requirement in our energy markets in California. And one of the exciting things about that is we used to worry about the so-called duck curve, the idea that during the day with more and more solar, we would hollow out the net demand. This is midnight and this is the end of the day. And essentially the marginal price of renewables would go to zero or even negative. Well, now by requiring these energy storage installations and by using electric vehicles in so-called vehicle to grid mode, we're talking about taking that quote unquote excess green energy and utilizing it to deal with this high ramp when businesses are still on at the end of the day and people come home and turn things on. Thinking about a world where the mixture of renewables and storage really gives us a different market view. That's a dramatic change. Now I'm going to end by just highlighting one last feature, and that is when we think about environmental justice, it comes in many forms. It's not just the fence line polluters that Vice President Biden talked about last night. It's also the fact that we see in our new energy projects that we are not finding ways to bring clean energy to people equitably. In fact, when you look across the United States, what we unfortunately see is that solar is far more prevalent on the rooftops of white households than Latino or African-American households. And that's a function of us having done a very poor job in assisting clean energy startups in diverse communities and not finding ways to really emphasize through our spending that we can make the clean energy revolution part of an equity revolution. And I won't go into more details, we'll save it for the conversation. But this is the kind of thing that we need to do differently. And I would argue you've already heard from one of the 2 presidential candidates who's talking about investing significantly in clean energy development, clean energy markets, and making spending on social and racial justice core to that. Vice President Biden's plan calls for 40% of all federal spending in this clean energy revolution to be spent in low-income areas and those that are primarily disadvantaged by pollution. And it really, to me, speaks to the transition of markets and a new post-COVID world, thinking about how we can benefit not only climate-wise, but socially from this transition. So let me stop there and just looking forward to the next comments and to the dialogue.
Dan, fantastic. You can see what a rich conversation we're about to have. Robert, take us home, and then we can let the games begin.
Okay, so let me, my name is Robert Kaufman, and Peter introduced me, but he forgot perhaps the most important impact I've ever had other than bicycling is I'm co-founder, or was co-founder of First Fuel, a company that figured out a way to do energy audits at scale. And I would like to think that a lot of my discussion is going to be about how people can think about starting green related businesses, because after all, if a really nerdy introvert like me can do it, then almost any human being can do it. What I want to talk about is a paper that's coming out in Nature Energy, and it's talking about the relationships among electric vehicle adoption, charging stations, the cost of rooftop solar, and the actual installation of that rooftop solar. And what's important, I think, about this article is it highlights the importance of non-economic factors. The way that people think about these carbon-free technologies really is going to play an important role in the rate at which they're adopted. But let me start first with what we're living through, the reason why I'm sitting in my dining room, and that is the pandemic. And there's nothing, as Dan alluded to, there's nothing really good to be said for the pandemic with regard to renewable energy, but maybe we can learn something from the pandemic, and maybe something we can figure out how to squeeze something good from the pandemic. And I think there are three things related to environmental or green energy decision-making that will come out of the pandemic. First is, when you look at predictions of how this pandemic was going to go, it seems that scientists had it right and politicians had it wrong. And one of the things that I hope is that trust in science, based upon a track record, will now translate to climate change. And indeed, there was a poll in the New York Times reporting that when they looked at the issues in this election, a very large fraction of people actually believed climate change was real and something needed to be done about it. So it seems like the pandemic has perhaps primed the pump a little bit. The other thing is, many of us are spending a lot of time at home, and we're looking around at our homes and thinking, how can I improve my home? You know, I'm spending a lot of time here. Maybe if I got rooftop solar, if I put in these split, air conditioning, heating systems. So people are looking at improving their homes, not just buying bigger TVs, but really improving the operational efficacy of their homes. And the last thing is kind of counterintuitive, perhaps, and that is this notion of self-sufficiency. We've all kind of become self-contained pods where we get groceries in, and that's about it. And one of the things that I think is gonna come out of this pandemic is people are gonna wanna feel a little more self-sufficient when it comes to energy. And maybe that means putting rooftop solar on their homes, or not worrying about charging their electric vehicles, or not going to the gas station for gasoline. So keeping with Dan's photography, if I was a better photographer, you would see the three things that I want to talk about today. You'd see rooftop solar on this house. You'd see an electric vehicle, a Chevy Bolt, not necessarily a Tesla, but still a very nice car, Bolt in the driveway. And if you looked really carefully, you could see a charging station charging that car right now. And really, that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the relationships among rooftop solar, the cost of installing that rooftop solar, electric vehicles, and charging stations. And what we might think normally is the arrows run vertically between these two columns. But when we do a fairly sophisticated statistical analysis with data from zip codes in Massachusetts over the last 5 years, we see relations moving in many directions that have to do with environmental decision-making. And so the first thing I want to think about is that first relationship there, between rooftop solar and electric vehicles. And at first glance, that's a kind of surprising relationship. There's no direct link really between rooftop solar and electric vehicles, other than this idea of perhaps environmental complementarity. That is, if you're striving to reduce your carbon footprint, you can reduce your carbon footprint by installing rooftop solar and/or buying an electric vehicle. The other thing that these two things have in common is they're really visible. That is, as Dan's photograph showed, you can see those cells on the roofs of houses from the sidewalk. And here in Massachusetts and in many other states, electric vehicles have their own license plate. So you know when you're seeing these things. And these first two factors are important because they influence social norms. Social norms are kind of the glue that holds society together, and they influence the way that people make decisions. And the reason why that's important is once social norms take on an importance, that is, our neighborhood wants to contribute to a carbon-free future, these social norms start to really supplement and in many cases replace pure economic analyses of whether I buy rooftop solar or whether I buy an electric vehicle. It's not just a pure cost-benefit analysis anymore. It's kind of, I want to fit in, I want to be seen contributing to this greater environmental goal. The other thing that we found was not surprising, as Dan pointed out, is that there's learning by doing. The more rooftop solar we install, we lower the installation costs. And that's really important, not so much at the level of the PV module, but it's getting those green jobs and having the workforce learn what they're doing, understanding how this works, and reducing the costs of the installation per se, not just the module. And then once we lower those costs, that enhances installation. And so again, you have this very nice feedback loop that I'm going to come back to at the end. The last thing that I want to talk about with regard to these feedback loops is a kind of surprising result. And that is, we didn't find any relationship between people buying electric vehicles and installing charging stations. And at first glance, that's kind of a surprising result because people are very aware of this range anxiety. That is, charging up your battery will only get you so far. And for most electric vehicles, not all, but most, a full charge on your battery will not take you as far as a full tank of gas. But to some degree, that range anxiety is really misplaced because on average in the US, a car trip is about 23 miles. So you're not going to run out of charge in those 23 miles. And by the time you get home, you can recharge your car at home. And our analysis of charging stations only looked at public charging stations, not at home charging stations. And so maybe a more sophisticated analysis of electric vehicles and charging stations could look at housing type. As Dan pointed out, there's a real environmental justice issue here in that those single family detached homes, it's really easy to install a charging station. But if you live in rental housing in an urban environment, oftentimes you're not allowed to install a charging station, or you're not able to get easy access to a charging station. So maybe there's a link in certain zip codes that we've kind of ignored or are less prevalent in Massachusetts. The other thing is charging equipment. There are now charging stations that can recharge your battery in about half an hour, the time it takes to eat a Dunkin' Donuts at a charging gas station along the highway. So maybe if we corrected for charging stations, that would be possible. So what are the policy implications here? Once upon a time, even though I'm in a Department of Earth and Environment, I taught in a Department of Geography. And one of the things that we've kind of ignored, I think by we, I mean the academic community, is that space matters. If we look at current efforts in Massachusetts to enhance rooftop solar and the adoption of electric vehicles, it's all about just buy the vehicle, we'll send you a check, or install the rooftop solar, and we'll send you an SREC, which is kind of a subsidy for that rooftop solar. But really what we want to do is design policies that encourage the first installations or the first purchases of electric vehicles by zip code. Because once you get people seeing these cars or seeing these rooftop solar installations in their zip code, in their neighborhood, that is what triggers this kind of alternate or a decision-making process that is an alternative to strict dollars and cents. And perhaps there are ways to better allocate these subsidies by zip code than making it just purely about or ignoring where people live. And that too would enhance environmental justice, because traditionally the first adopters tend to be fairly wealthy people. But if you really increase those initial incentives by zip code, people in poorer zip codes can get bigger subsidies, which will make these technologies more available. The last thing I want to talk about is this finding of feedback loops in our statistical analysis. So as I show here in the bottom, if you do something to enhance the adoption of rooftop solar, that also affects electric vehicles. It also affects electric installation costs, and those two feedback on each other. So any single policy that targets electric vehicles, that targets rooftop solar, or makes or improves or lowers installation costs, that has a multiplier effect by echoing or bouncing around those three components. And if we can find a way to get charging stations as part of that feedback loop, we can really accelerate this transition towards a carbon-free future. And what I would leave the audience thinking about is, how can I take advantage of perhaps these non-economic components of decision-making and design startups and companies that really target these non-economic decision-making processes? How can I design a business model based upon these decision-making processes that enhance the adoption of green energy? So let me stop there.
Thank you, Robert. As usual, very, very interesting food for thought. And look forward to seeing the analysis on paper and putting it on the BUISE's website, as we do for all the work of our affiliated faculty. Wonderful. We've come to the discussion portion, and we've got a couple questions in the Q&A. Please add some more if you have them. And I'm going to take the liberty of the chair and begin with a couple of questions for all the panel that I think are cross-cutting and vexing, at least to me. The first one I want to ask you guys, we heard a lot about storage, and Dan showed us some of the data on storage costs coming down in different stores. But we all know that long duration storage is really barely available in the marketplace today. And my question for you all is, what long duration storage technologies do you foresee the industry using in this rapid push to decarbonize it? What would be the technologies, and how are we going to finance those new batteries? If you have an opinion on it, and you can pass if you don't, But let's go the same order we did in the panel. And so Amy, Dan, Robert, a two-part question.
So I think I would start by saying that, as Dan mentioned, there's more than one way to promote a balancing of the grid. One of the interesting things that's come out of recent research about the post-COVID energy experience is that people who are not commuting, so residential electricity, are getting up later because they're up binging Netflix later into the evening before they go to bed. And I'm kidding, but that's probably part of it. But not only is technology enabling the duck curve to flatten, the increase in residential applications versus commercial applications is such that we're also flattening the duck curve. And we can do that several ways. We can do that because we're all working from home, or some segment of actually it's a very small segment of the population is working from home, but we can do that by encouraging telecommuting. But we can also do that on purpose with software that automatically does that for us. And our utilities may someday be able to reach in and turn on and off our appliances for a period of time, or do that with businesses. And then we can also do that, as Daniel mentioned, with different technologies, whether that's hydrogen for long-term storage. I know some audience members, hydro might not be popular, but Vermont's at 90% renewables, basically by aligning with hydro in Quebec. So,
Okay, all right.
But let me just add one more thing that I think is a very important part of the picture, which is that when we're talking about how people use electricity and we're talking about social justice, it's not about just putting solar panels someplace where on apartment buildings in low-income communities. This is about, we use differential pricing for electricity in the United States. And I'll tell you how we use it. We give a discount to large, wealthy companies that have data centers and are big industrial users. And we heap the burden of that, and we subsidize them if they make an ESG statement and go to renewables. And then we heap the cost of that onto individual ratepayers who tend to be low-income people and people on fixed income. And there's no reason why, with political will, which we don't have, but if we did have, we couldn't change it so that we burden the people who need reliability the most, which is people with data centers, and charge them a premium for their electricity, and use that premium to subsidize the electricity costs for low-income people and give them a very inexpensive electricity cost. And we don't do that. Instead, we do these other things, like we weatherize their home, or we put a solar panel on one community in LA and think we've checked the box. But all we have to do is restructure how we price electricity in the United States, and we could solve the social equity problem overnight.
Food for thought. Dan?
So I'll get back to your storage question, but just kind of to pile on Amy's great comment. In fact, that's why some of the places that we didn't used to think as exciting in the federal government, such as working at the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, if the FERC and the state public utilities commissions took what Amy just said, let's have low-cost pricing for low-income individuals, and shift that burden and essentially flip it the way we think that government should work, we could go a long way, not only in terms of making energy more affordable for low-income people, but also for incentivizing the question you asked, Peter, about storage. And so what gets all the attention in the world of storage today is lithium-ion batteries, but they are short. They are hour-long duration technologies. What we need for this long duration world is actually currently the hottest topic in research at the US Department of Energy, in the California research offices in Europe. And that's not only the hydrogen that Amy suggested, which I actually think will likely be the biggest piece of our not only long-term storage need, but also for heavy industry where batteries are not as ideally suited. But we also have opportunities to think about, for example, large new offshore wind that makes electricity when the price is high and hydrogen when the price is low. We have a big project with University of California, Merced, and several new companies where they are doing literally Lego block storage, meaning that they move concrete blocks up cranes when electricity is plentiful and cheap, and they bring that energy down, the potential energy. And so you get things that are really simple. We used to call that pumped hydro, but in California, where we don't have a lot of water, why don't we pump rock and concrete, not hydro? And so there are lots of interesting technologies, but because storage wasn't seen as a long-term need in the past, we didn't march down those learning curves. And I actually think that this long-term storage problem won't be that big a deal if we build these markets, in particular because, just in taking place in California, we have almost 1 million electric vehicles on the roads. And so you can have a compact with your utility, like Amory said, where when they need power, they'll ask you, not you, they'll ask your your meter, can we sell you less power? Could you sell power back from your system? And electric vehicles plugged in garages, just like Robert said, are a great place to store some of that energy. And so taking advantage of all of these actually means that making the markets value two-way transactions, where we specifically make this pro clean energy and pro equity, actually means I think these markets will not be hard to build. Now, we need to win this next election and get the US back on a reasonable track, but these are actually not that hard to do. They might look different, but they're actually things for which an Internet of Things, a smart energy system, could really bring to bear.
Thank you. Excellent. Robert, do you want to add something briefly? Because we have—
Yeah, just very briefly. I would say that prices are not going to be the way to reform electricity. I worked with several people in Madison Park, which is public housing in Massachusetts and Boston. They really don't get a bill, and the bill is split evenly among everybody. Instead, I would go back to what we did with First Fuel. Electric utilities and the people who manage the grid have strong incentives to reduce their costs. And if you can get the people who are managing the grid to install storage and carbon-free technologies that balance the load and reduce the wear and tear on substations, that'll go a lot faster than working the consumer end of the market.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's turn to the questions. Thank you, audience. You've put in a whole raft of very interesting questions. To try to get through more of them, with the panelists' permission, what I'm going to do is to just call on whichever of you I think spoke most about this particular issue. And the other panelists, if you feel compelled to add something to that, by all means, but don't feel compelled, so we can get through a few more questions if you want to just leave it at one answer. So Robert, I'm going to give this first one to you. Will social acceptance towards renewable energy infrastructure still be an important factor to study if the technology is making it so, I think, so that the infrastructure can be more personalized to household needs? Founder of First Fuel, what do you say?
Well, I would just say that people have to feel comfortable with the technology, and they have to feel like it's reliable, like the way what they're used to, and the rest will take care of itself. I just believe that people don't want to change their electricity lives, their energy lives. Reliability is so important to them. So if you can get them comfortable with the technology, that will go a long way beyond the economics.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone else compelled to jump in? Okay. This question from Yutong C is, in addition to rooftop solar, how do you view the disparities in solar option of other forms such as community solar in the US? Considering the existing low-income solar programs at the state level, how do you view the fact that low-income people are still not benefiting from the policy perspective? I think, Amy, you want to try it?
I'm thinking that's better for one of the other two, no?
Okay, Dan, you want to try it?
Sure. I mean, I think that the question got it right, and Robert really highlighted some of that, and that is in places like California, we already subsidize low-income people quite significantly. There's almost $2 billion spent each 18 months. It turns out our cycle for spending it's a little funny, but the options to think about how do you make clean energy an asset for people who don't own their roof is a really critical part of the story. So here we have a solar gardens law, and that allows nearby big box stores, grocery stores and others to host solar for third parties. And what this does is it allows a partnership between landlords and renters that are not always aligned. So it's not always easy to work out, where they basically get to think of that rooftop solar as their asset, even though it's physically not on the roof. What the law requires here is that the savings are shared between the property owner and the renter. I would personally like to see something which pushes more towards the renter because they are the people more often on fixed income. But these strategies to think about the energy system not as a simple, if you don't own the box, you can't build it, but as something built into the community is a very important part of the next step. And the related piece, of course, is that we have another form of related energy environmental injustice, and that is that in most booming economies around the country, in Boston Route 128, around Austin, Texas, here in Silicon Valley, you literally have to drive until you qualify to either buy a home or to rent a home. And it means the lowest income people commute the longest distance, spend the least time home with their kids. So one of the things that we have not solved here in California, but are battling over, is how to make infill rent-controlled apartment near transit hubs something that we emphasize. And unfortunately, single-family homeowners have found ways to resist this in lots of areas, including California. But the idea that we would coordinate where we have mass transit, like our light rail in Southern California and the so-called BART system, the Bay Area Rapid Transit in the north, and tie those to areas where we are controlling the rents is a critical part of the story. And then if you throw in low-cost rentals for electric vehicles, for example, Lyft, which has 2 million drivers, just said they would go to an all-electric fleet by 2030, and they would provide very low-cost rentals for EVs. That's something that I predict we'll be able to do even sooner than 2030. But it's an example of areas where electromobility can actually be a source of justice.
Let me just add one quick 2-minute point to that, because I think
Sure. By all
Professor
means.
Kammen really outlined it. And that is this. We're creating systems to correct market failures, right? So we're coming up with a big subsidy program. That means that A, I have to know to apply for the subsidy. Then I got to pay all the people who are administering the subsidy when I could just have fair pricing for electricity. So with all due respect to the person who posted that question, you know, I guess it's creating jobs for people to come up with subsidies to the people who are knowledgeable enough, or a community activist that's getting somebody signed up for the subsidy. But we're coming up, everything in energy is we're having an after the fact, inefficient market solution to solve an existing structural market failure, when we could just design the market to serve our values. You know, market design is not this magical capitalistic thing that happens on its own. It's done by human beings who have to assess what our goals are for the market. What do we want the market to do, right? And, you know, if I were a person who spent all their time on social justice, which is not my focus, which is why I defer to others, right? But if I were to change my entire research agenda and focus only on social justice, my focus would be that we have a structurally designed system that is unjust, and that our market design is unjust. And if we were going to create a just market design, we would have to change the way we do, with all due respect to Dr. Kaufman, electricity pricing, taxes, incentives, subsidies. All of those things go into what makes an unjust economic system.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Okay, let's keep going because we have lots of good questions yet to go through. But I do like it when you guys take issue with each other. And if I may make one comment from the chair to endorse some aspect of what you just said, Dan, I think the United States has long had a distinct crisis in housing, in affordable housing. And that crisis must be addressed alongside the climate crisis. And that calls for kind of a combined strategy of getting more housing built. But I agree with you, in places that are affordable and where you can reach them, and you can do that consistent with a decarbonized economy. And so there's a housing dimension of this that we don't talk about enough. This next one, I'm not sure. One of you, please raise your hand to do it. Very important point from Eric Grunbaum. Do you think the recent Consumer Reports white paper on ICE versus EV repair costs will change the EV discussion for people who are not early adopters? The headline on September 24th was, quote, electric vehicle owners spending half as much on maintenance compared to gas-powered vehicle owners, finds new CR analysis. One of you raise your hand.
Well, I'm waving my arms. So
all right.
That's exactly my point. And I hate to say it, nobody's going to read that Consumer Reports white paper. But if you talk to your neighbor, so I have that Chevy Bolt. I don't get anything, no oil change. I don't have a muffler, none of that stuff. If I've talked to my neighbors about, oh, you know, this car doesn't have any of that stuff. That's what I meant by this kind of social norms, social communication, kind of overriding the pure economic components of, do I buy an electric vehicle or not? Or if they see rooftop solar on my house, they say, how's that working out for you? And that's how things really move, at least according to our analysis.
Let me just add to that. I had an electric car in California, and I didn't have the Bolt. I had the even smaller battery on this C-Max from Ford. Battery only went 20 miles. And I got an argument with the electric car team at Davis because they said I had to stop saying that all my vehicle miles traveled was on the battery. So they actually put a little thing in my car to prove to me that I was wrong. And they found that actually over 65% of my driving was electric. So, and my husband, who had a sports car, took my car to do errands because he didn't want to go to the gasoline station. He wanted to use that car, the electric car. So just throwing it out there that if more people had the cars, they would realize that they don't even need a fast charger. You know, they could just, you know, plug in the garage and do their errands and come back, because most people don't actually go every weekend to the mountains. There's a very small number of people who can afford and have the luxury to do that. And for the rest of us who are just going to the bank and the grocery store, you know, a pretty small battery is good enough.
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that what people are saying here is exactly right. And that is that these Consumer Reports might have some marginal impact on the nerds, but you really need this kind of social learning about technologies. We've had an electric car for 2 years. We've charged away from home twice. Away from home or away from the university where there are some charging stations. And now we're seeing cities here in California, Austin, Texas, elsewhere, that are not only installing charging stations downtown near businesses, but they're actually doing things like saying you get free charging for an hour at certain things, but then you have to move the car. So there's all kinds of interesting things you can do to enable this world. And the more that we can tilt those market forces towards justice, like Amy said, we're right on the money. Now, everything Amy said about the big picture issue is exactly right. The challenge, unfortunately, is one that's going to sound like a bureaucratic cop-out, and that is when you get new administrations at state or federal or other levels who want to get something done, they kind of take a moment to pause and they say, should we take on huge, massive systemic change, which we know will be fought and difficult, but we should do, or should we do these marginal things? And that's not an argument not to take on the big ones. What we found in a number of places, for example, in California, where we have some very aggressive sectoral targets, and we also have a carbon price, is that a lot of our near-term action is driven by these specific policies, the kind of difficult things that are sort of marginal add-ons to current policies. The hope is that in the long term, it will be the carbon pricing, or ideally the social cost of carbon, that will be something that we'll rely on more and more. Now, the problem is that it's kind of a chicken and egg. If you don't take on the big systemic things, then you're always cobbling policy together. I would argue actually this next administration, and I see one of the questions from Eric is sort of about what's coming next. The idea that we could do things differently now is really exciting. Senator Schumer from New York has proposed a Clean Cars for America program. That's an effort to think about going from the 1.5 million EVs in the country today, most of them in California, to 63 million EVs nationwide. That's a program where they have built in justice and equity to make vehicles available for low-income people as part of the program. It's an effort to tie charging access to where people live and work. Those are the kinds of things. There's policies like fee-bates, where you have a tax on a polluting product, whether it's a car or a refrigerator, and you transfer those funds to people who buy the efficient ones. It's an idea that has a lot of merit. It has not been used widely outside of France and Ireland, but it's an idea of basically putting a polluter tax, transferring credits, and having a carve out for low income people. So there are lots of really exciting big picture changes. But I agree, if I could start from the beginning, what Amy highlighted about not thinking about our electricity market, essentially the biggest part of our energy equation, not doing that in a way that directly addresses who's subsidized and who's not, is really critical, especially in a world where we today subsidize fossil fuels, depending on whose metric, between $500 billion and $5 trillion a year on a worldwide basis. That means the subsidy for fossil fuels is much larger than the annual spending on actual renewable hardware. So we are way out of kilter, but it would not be that hard in theory to make those big picture changes really the focus of how we re-envision the system.
And again, let me make a two-finger intervention for 1 second. You know, when you start putting on a carbon tax or a BTU tax or some sliding tax, and you haven't addressed the underlying structural problem of justice, then you're just raising the cost of energy for people with lower income that spend a higher percentage of their income on energy. So, you know, the problem with some of the solutions, and the reason there's been political pushback, is because, is it really addressing the problem? You know, I think, I forget whose study it was. Severin Orison, you know, did a study on the subsidies for electric cars that have gotten us off the ground in California. What do we find? Who bought those cars and got the subsidies? It's not low income people, right? So, you know,
The tax credit.
yeah. So the point is, you're right, tax credits. The point is we have to resist the urge to just tax our way out of it. And we still have to address, you know, I mean, you can have a tax, but it doesn't apply to this person or that person, or you could restructure the way you do pricing before you put on the tax, and then you would have less of a problem. I know how politically difficult it is, but you're just wallpapering over wallpaper over wallpaper over wallpaper, and then you're coming to me and say, can I paint over these 8 layers of wallpaper? When you could just strip the wallpaper, if you could, and then paint on a fresh surface.
Well, that's a powerful metaphor. Okay, thank you, panelists. We have quite a number of Q&A, and I'm worried that we won't get to them. So therefore, try to keep your answers a little short from here on. And also, panelists, when you're not talking, feel free to go into the Q&A, go working from the bottom up, and if you can, and if there's any that you can answer quickly online, that would be courteous to the, and I'm sure appreciated by the audience, which has really responded nicely. This one I have to do as a lightning round to all 3 of you, but please keep it brief. The future of nuclear power in the United States. Amy, Dan, Robert, briefly.
Small nuclear, innovative designs. DOE funded 3 groups, one of whom has a technology where they're going to use nuclear waste to do steam generation. Very promising technology. I think all the money spent in the United States on nukes needs to go into these innovative advanced nuclear, and that there could be some interesting technologies.
Dan.
Yes, as a professor of nuclear engineering, I can't resist, and I will keep it short. And that is, innovation is needed. We have now seen the Nuclear Regulatory Commission authorize the first plants. The earliest we would get one of these small modular nuclear trial plants at a national lab is 2026. And so when we talk about those learning curve cycles, it's going to be a real challenge, even if everything breaks right for the new technologies, for them to play a significant role before, call it 2040. That doesn't mean that if we do it right, they couldn't be a real part of the solution, but nuclear has not in the past been able to hit those price or performance points. Of course, the risk is big, but the real challenge is going to be, now that we have lots and lots of private sector billionaires in this field, can some of that private sector savvy mean that we innovate much faster without reducing safety? And that's going to be the challenge that nuclear is going to have to face, even though we have never had as many exciting new innovative technologies on the horizon as today.
Robert, you in on this or no? No, pass?
No.
Okay, well, those are extremely interesting. Okay, then on to Jordan Zucker's question. One of the things I've been most curious about is how we incentivize companies to aggressively push into areas which have historically enjoyed lower energy costs from fossil fuels. Is this something we should be looking for states and federal government to pursue, or is this something that companies will have to look to do on their own? Also, the tax credit for electric cars has been phenomenally successful, established under the Obama administration. With that being said, these incentives are set to expire relatively soon. What analytics should we look at to establish future tax credit incentives to get more consumers to look at these cars? So let's separate, there's a lot there. Let's separate them out. Let's do the first one. I'll cycle back to that. How do we incentivize companies to aggressively push into areas that have historically enjoyed lower energy costs from fossil fuels? Is this something we should be looking for states or the federal government to pursue, or is it something that companies will have to look to do on their own? Raise your hand. That's a tough one.
So I'll just take a bit of it. You cannot expect companies to do it on their own. The markets they're in, whether it's state or regional or the federal one, is going to have to play a role. Getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies is the most critical bottom line. If you're subsidizing much larger than we're spending on clean, it makes it really difficult to send the proper message, whether it's a policy or a price message. And setting up either these regional markets or the federal one, I would argue a carbon price is a natural baseline. It doesn't solve the problem entirely, but it starts the process of getting us to look at the whole cost. And it's not just energy. We also have to think about water and land. We really need to think about the ways in which we can incentivize companies, both public and private, to invest in things that are aligned with this climate goal.
Okay, I'm going to be slightly contentious, and I'm going to say that if we would, as a first step regulation, force companies to disclose the actual climate risk their assets and facilities face, and investors could read that, and it wasn't boilerplate, it was actually specific to individual companies, I think you'd see companies taking actions a hell of a lot faster if they really assessed what's the risk to their facilities, what's the risk to their personnel. You know, does water scarcity mean their utility actually is a threat to operations? How big's the liability to coal ash ponds? How big are the liabilities that oil companies face for the safety problems with wildfire? How big is the liabilities for the chemicals that are underneath the ground in their facilities in Philadelphia and other places? And what does that mean for groundwater? I think if we had a real forced disclosure that was actually policed by the SEC, you would see that investors would be concerned about those risks and companies would be forced to take action.
Very, very interesting. The second part of this, I think I am, oops, did one of you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that I think the most important thing I learned from being in First Fuel is that people do not care about energy per se. They don't want to think about it. It's a small part of their budget. You want to design things so that the firms with creative business models take care of the problem. So the classic example is, I have rooftop solar on my house. I didn't pay for it. I didn't want to think about it. I got Sunrun. Sunrun came to me. I don't own any stock in Sunrun, with a very imaginative business model where I did nothing and all of a sudden rooftop solar was on my house. When we went to people with First Fuel, why should you do an audit to your building? They don't care about it. You have to find other ways than just price to get people to act.
Mm-hmm. Well, while you're up, Robert, I'm going to give the second part of this to you first. What analytics should we look at to establish future tax credits or incentives to get consumers to look at EVs? That's an analytics question.
Yeah, you know, I go back to this. If I were to come back in another life, I would do decision making. And I think people should abandon the analytics associated with kind of a pure price effect and this kind of decision, this, I forget the name of the models, but the models that look at the decision-making process. And that's the way to go. Sorry, I'm not too eloquent about it.
No worries. That's very, very interesting and a great question. These are great questions, audience, hard ones. This one from Monir Azam is right up there. Have any of the panelists given thought to establishing quantitative methods for valuing and incentivizing resilience above and beyond reducing carbon footprint and grid support? This can help rapidly advance storage and virtual power plant platforms. So anyone want to raise their hand on this? Robert?
Yeah, again, going back to First Fuel, electric utilities, among their major costs or grid managers is substations, replacing all the equipment in substations. If you can find a way to help the managers of the grid manage the load in buildings in a way that prolongs the life of substations, perhaps with battery storage, perhaps by putting rooftop solar on buildings, you will have a natural ally in the grid managers who will help achieve the goal of clean energy while increasing resilience and the like?
So just to follow on that, in California, we actually call this the market for negawatts, meaning that it's not just about generating assets, but if you give companies and building managers credit for energy saved, and it's not just energy. In California, we actually arguably have a bigger problem with a lack of water than a lack of clean energy. And so we put in market prices. Now, California, for anyone who's watched the movie Chinatown, I know it's old for some of the younger people, know that we are as corrupt in our water market as any horrific situation, but in putting in price signals that reward both resiliency and also that reward adaptation. So thinking ahead about buildings and neighborhoods that are themselves cleaner and lower cost. That's something that we've started to do through a bill called Senate Bill 375 that actually says that when a city plans out a new housing development or a new mall or anything, they have to take into account the anticipated future driving and its environmental impact. If everyone was an EV, it would literally be just road maintenance and the energy that comes from power plants. But right now, that's not the case. And so we have mechanisms that we could be spreading more widely. They actually do this in Denmark now as well, where you need to think about the whole ecological cost for development projects. These turn out not to be that complicated. They're actually not more complicated than our health system, that's for sure. And these are all places where we could be doing much more thoughtful, resilient planning that would save us money in the long term.
Very, very interesting. We ready for the next one? Okie doke. This from Jordan Zucker. California has had some issues over the past few years in LA County with providing consistent electrical output both to residential and commercial zones. With recent wildfires increasing in intensity and a lack of protection for traditional power delivery, how will California be able to accept a massive ramp up in the amount of electricity required from its already struggling electrical grid? I think, Dan, you get that first.
Maybe also have thoughts on this one too. But so it turns out that in the recent blackouts we had, while there was lots of debate about renewables, it was actually the natural gas peaker plants, the kind of legacy facilities that tripped offline much more so than solar output going down because we had these horrific orange skies that you all saw. So California started in 2014 by requiring energy storage to be sited by the utilities. That's the picture I showed of that facility in Southern California. So it is very clear that to ramp up our supply to both meet our current supply needs, but also future electric vehicles, that one of the things that we need to do is to integrate storage and local generation much more into our urban and suburban areas. Putting solar on rooftops, transparent solar for windows, all of this tied in a smart grid way to distributed energy storage means that we can make the system more resilient, but we can also increase dramatically the supply where it's used. And that allows us to meet building needs, but also transportation needs. And that's the direction for which right now the state is about to release its new plan, consistent with this new announcement last month that we're going to end the sale of internal combustion vehicles. So it's really a smart distributed play for more generation and more storage is at least the plan going on here right now.
Did you want to jump in, Amy?
Well, I would just say that increasingly what you're going to see is that businesses that have to worry about it, and we're also seeing this in Houston with the hurricane preparedness. Businesses or individuals that are concerned are going to create, distributed network for their home or for their community or for their business. And I think the question is going to be, what is the backup plan of choice? Because all of these systems, we now have the software capability of having an automation response where it islands itself automatically the second there's any kind of problem in the grid, right? So nothing's going to help you if a wildfire is actually affecting your actual building or your actual building has a flood. But if you're just concerned about the resilience or the safety from the grid, I think what people are finding is the slogan is DERs, these distributed energy, what does the R stand for? Maybe it's anyway, these mini grids.
Resources.
Distributed energy resource.
Yeah, these mini grids are going to be very enabling. And again, it gets to this question: how do I integrate mini grids into my utility system? So in New York City, they've started this new thing called Proposal for Solutions, where instead of letting the utility build some giant new substation or other kind of infrastructure, which they would get a rate return on, and therefore their incentive is just expand, and then pass it on to the ratepayer. New York came up with this system where they have a call for solutions in particular locations. And if somebody can offer a DER solution that's really cost effective, they don't let the utility build something large. They go with this other kind of solution, and then they split it. A third to ratepayers, a third to the utility, a third to the underwriter for the DER. So they're trying to manage moving how infrastructure gets financed and paid for, and what goes to the ratepayer and what goes to the utility. But until we tame utilities, I know that's unpopular with probably some people on the panel, but until we tame these utilities, and again, Amy Jaffe, broken record, changed the pricing system and the regulatory system for utilities, it's hard to get to these resilient systems like island DERs. And I believe in the island DERs. I've been in a situation where I've benefited from island and DERs. And, New Jersey, you have communities that had a DER. After Hurricane Sandy, they were back in 3 days, and then some neighboring town was out for 2 months. So definitely can be successful.
Great. Well, I'm going to transition us to the conclusion using a device that many of us have heard weekend after weekend on the fabulous NPR show, Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me. Even though I have no Bill Curtis here, and I am hardly a Peter Sagal, I'm a Peter Fox Penner. But what they do is thank their sponsors and then go back to the panelists for a quick lightning round, a really quick one, for one phrase lightning round. And so let me thank our sponsors. Northeast Clean Energy Council, our sponsor for our entire series. BU's Pardee Center for the Study of the Long Run Future, a wonderful fellow institute. The Earth and Environment Department at BU, where Robert and many of our colleagues at the ISE teach, do research. And then finally, the Intrepid BU Energy and Sustainability Club, our partner for almost all the events that we do at the ISE. I also want to invite all of you to our next panel, which is on November 20th, and it's going to be about the intersection between manufacturing policy in the United States and bringing back advanced manufacturing and climate policies, a really important intersection that's received, we think, not enough attention. So please look for that, and you can sign up for it on our website. And panelists, as they say on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, carbon pricing versus other federal investments. How much will carbon pricing play a role? Amy?
Tool, but not salvo. I think what we're going to find is, market design, regulation, targets are not going to be able to be substituted by just simply having carbon prices.
Dan?
I agree. I think it's a two-pronged strategy. Near term, it's regulation, it's thoughtful policy. Longer term, pricing makes sense.
Robert?
Much less than economists hope, and much less than economists hope.
And as Bill Curtis would say, and if any of that happens, you'll hear about it at a future BUISE webinar with experts like these. Thank you so much, Amy Myers-Jaffe, Professor Dan Kammen, Professor Robert Kaufman, Dr. Amy Myers-Jaffe, all of you, fantastic conversation. I think the richest set of discussions and questions I think I've seen in a long time. Thanks to all of you who hung in there through it, and we'll see you again on future BUISE webinars. Take care, stay safe, wear your mask. Thank you.